I love a Western, the good, bad, and ugly, but I wouldn't want to live there. But it does feel like some Brexiteers are excited by this type of society. And we keep hearing this word, deregulation.
But you've got to cut unnecessary regulation.
But we've had a couple of years and made people think that we should have lots of regulation, and it's been difficult for those of us who believe in free markets and free enterprise. But I'm going to disagree in a Christmassy sense, because I see we're all here obeying regulations, aren't we? I mean, this party is not going to be investigated by the police in a year's time. You are all very carefully socially distanced.
Hindering regulations is a massive impediment to growth for businesses.
The same deregulation that caused the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the deregulation that helped create the 2008 crash.
We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
And this deregulation reminds me of the lawless cowboy films. And instead of guns ruling society, it's money. Key Brexiteers want a lawless society within business, where you can do what you want, when you want, and not to worry about consequences. Essentially, free market Brexiteers want business run without a sheriff. The worst part is we constantly see what happens to people in the UK when there is no sheriff to protect them. This is Richard Tice. He's the leader of the Reform Party and former deputy leader of the Brexit Party. And he has some interesting words to say on this Sky News programme, which I'm going to dissect and show you is very similar to wanting to live in the wild, wild west.
You didn't have to, because you've done such a great job in getting tax take down to less than 30%. And I repeat what I say, it's now 30% and heading north. And that is a massive constraint on productivity, on growth, on the desire of people and businesses to invest in the UK. And so it's quite right to go for low taxes.
And it's this old thing that they keep hashing up. They want low taxes, so they want US taxes with Scandinavian services. You cannot have an NHS with a low tax system.
But you've got to cut unnecessary regulation.
So that means no sheriff. That's what he means when he says deregulation. No one keeping oversight as to what's going on. Next, we have immigration.
The CBI has been saying employers are crying out for people to do jobs. More than 1 million EU citizens went home after Brexit.
I take issue with what Trevor just said there. They went home. How does he know that some of them hadn't considered Britain to be home and that they wanted to set down roots here? But because of what was taking place in the UK and with the Brexit referendum, they left. It's really sinister when people say stuff like that.
Did Brexit not shoot us in the foot and actually provide the single biggest obstacle to growth now?
It's exactly the opposite. Why did we have the lowest growth decade since the Second World War in the last decade? The answer is because we've had no real wage growth.
Yes, of course, Richard. It's got nothing to do with the fact that you had a huge crash in 2008, created in part by deregulation of the mortgage market, as well as an insane economic policy related to austerity. And of course, Richard comes back with,
because we had unlimited freedom of movement.
The real problem came from 2008 and the Bank of England printing too much money, which devalued everyone else's money, which devalued your money that you get in your paycheck. That's why inflation's so high. But of course, Richard would have you believe it's to do with the boogeyman, the EU, always causing evil, or migrants, never dissecting what's gone wrong with the economy in Britain and why it doesn't work for everyone, and why it could, but it won't, because it would need a huge overhaul.
We haven't got a people shortage in this country. We've tragically got 5.3 million
Well,
people.
there's no big employer would agree with you.
Trevor, there are 5.3 million people on out-of-work benefits. And there's a
This is the
reason
number I think he's referring to, the 5.2 million, so I can't even get that right. But on top of that, look at what it says about the number on incapacity benefits. 2 million. And he's shocked by this, as if any of us should be. It's pure and simple. COVID happened. People have been damaged by it. If you delve further into the statistics, you start to find really interesting things, like part of the reason that these people are economically inactive is because they're long-term sick, or they're students, which we need, and he talks about, or they're full-time carers for their partners, or they're retired. There's very few in the other category, and yet he's insistent that this group be put back to work. I could just see it now. You've got some sort of crazy situation where he's demanding some 80-year-old get up on the roof and start tiling. And the fact is, do you really think someone like Richard is the type of person who could actually go out and do a full day's work in labour? I don't think he could.
We've got 1.5 million more people on out-of-work benefits than pre-COVID, and that is a tragedy of wasted talent.
The NHS was promised 18 billion a year from Brexit. It has now got 3 billion a year. But if you had that investment, it would help and go a long way to helping some of these people recover. There's another side to this. It might be the case that a lot of these people can never recover from the effects of COVID. But Richard will never tell you that.
And we have to, as a nation, support, help and train and get these people back into work. And then we haven't got a labour shortage.
We haven't got enough bodies.
It's not, you've absolutely hit it on the head. You've said social care is low paid. That's a disgrace. It's a vital, vital industry. We shouldn't be just naturally assuming that they should be lowly paid. I go back to the age-old way that economies work. If you can't find the labour, you pay more.
But Richard just said he wants low taxes, so he doesn't want to pay more.
You didn't have to, because you've done such a great job in getting tax take down to less than 30%. And either the labour arrives or you invest in capital equipment, right? So, for example, why haven't we invested in the combine harvester for apple picking?
Here's the apple picker from 2021. It's an apple harvester. Look at the number of apples on the floor. The technology isn't there. It's complicated. But Richard doesn't know that. He's in La La Land.
Additionally, because the UK had this special status as the less regulated, less low-tax, English-speaking, rule of law place, not that all of that was in question elsewhere in the EU, and certainly Ireland was similar, but had this special place, and people liked living in London, you had a huge amount of investment in the UK as a platform to enter the EU because you were part of the EU deal. That goes away. It may not go to zero. It will gradually come down. I see a representative, for example, of Toyota Motor Corporation here. Toyota, Nissan, Ford all have disproportionate amounts of their European auto production in the UK. All have indicated that they will not expand those production, will probably decline those production points in the UK when the UK loses full market access.
That, in a sense, the EU's tried to punish us for having the temerity to leave.
It's not the case. Not fully anyway. The EU have got more bargaining power than we do. But what we can turn around and say is, the Brexiteers triggered Article 50 because they wanted to get it over and done with as quickly as possible. And it's not that easy to untangle the UK from the EU. Have a listen to the former head of the WTO.
Very specific interpretation of Article 50 was not the EU interpretation. It was the British Prime Minister was under formidable pressure from Brexiters who said, Brexit is Brexit. We have to do it now. We have to do it now. And in order to do it now, let's start the process, negotiate a withdrawal agreement, and then we will see.
But of course, Brexiters won't take responsibility for forcing our hand when we could have had time to negotiate over this over a longer period of time, which frankly was necessary.
But let's remember, trade with Europe is it's a minority, really quite a small part of our overall economy. And
just more nonsense. 39% in total of our exports go to EU members. You trade most with your closest and historically closest neighbours. That's a fact. And lo and behold, look what you see here. We're exporting the most to the EU. 46.3% of our imports come from EU countries. What he is saying there is nothing short of a lie. Is he going to get caught up on it? Of course not.
And what Ken's rightly said is you've got to focus on investment and productivity and growth, but you only get that by having lower taxes.
Lower taxes, but he wants higher wages for those in social care.
You've said social care is low paid. That's a disgrace. It's sensible regulations. When Ken was in charge, we didn't have the burden of another 20 years of daft EU regulations. But what this government's failed to do is to start to reduce those. And that has a real impact. The impact of hindering regulations is a massive impediment to growth for business.
Again, it's that obsession with deregulation. They do not want a sheriff in town. They want to be able to go riding around doing whatever they want, whenever they want, and no oversight whatsoever. Luckily for us, a cowboy does step into the role and shoots down a lot of Richard's arguments.
The policy of the present government, forced upon it by its rather fanatic right-wing element that it's now got, rather too many of on the backbenches, is to seek free trade agreements with the entire globe, including pursuing free trade agreements with the United States and India, neither of which are actually very interested.
Deal with the Mexico-Canada arrangement. Tell us, is that possible from where you're sitting, Brendan Boyle, that the UK could enter into that deal?
I serve on the committee that would have to vote on it, and I can tell you I haven't heard one word about that. I mean, it is just not a subject that ever comes up here. It does sometimes in the context of Northern Ireland. Aside from that, though, frankly, it's just not an issue that ever comes up.
In a free trade agreement with us, but to keep putting more trade barriers between ourselves and our biggest single market, our obviously easiest trading partner, our next door neighbours, one of the wealthiest economic power blocks in the world.
All right. Well, I have to say, I wasn't expecting to see Ken Clarke ride into town and shoot holes in all of Richard Tice's arguments, but he did a pretty successful job. What I can say is be aware of anyone that keeps saying the words deregulation, because quite frankly, what they're really saying is we don't want to pay for a sheriff to protect you. And on a final note, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of my supporters from Patreon and YouTube. You keep this channel growing and going. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.